It's really something else how these figures from history, people who lived centuries ago, can still, evoke such strong feelings today.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
It is, lately, one name which just keeps coming up, and always with a lot of controversy surrounding it, is Aurangzeb.
Oh, absolutely.
We're seeing, actual calls for his tomb to be demolished.
I know.
Just stop and think about that for a second. I mean, a grave, centuries old, becoming a target for demolition. And what's even more, I guess, unsettling is that it's not even like a grand tomb or anything. This relatively modest burial site has become like a focal point for political tension and, sadly, even violence.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder why a long-dead emperor is still causing such a stir.
It does, yeah.
And that's what we're going to really dig into today.
Okay.
We've been going through a ton of news reports and all sorts of historical analogies that look at Aurangzeb, and more importantly, at how his story is being kind of used and interpreted in India today.
Right.
And I guess our mission today is to understand not just the history, but the present day, the motivations that are fueling this ongoing conflict. About his legacy, yeah.
It's really remarkable, isn't it, that a ruler from over 300 years ago can still elicit such strong reactions.
I know.
Even to the point of, demands to just destroy his final resting place. I mean, for listeners, it might feel like something out of a history book, not like, headlines in today's news.
Yeah.
But this isn't just some isolated event. It's really a much deeper reflection of how we grapple with our own history and, how that then shapes our present reality.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with just what's been happening recently, because it really, highlights how intense this whole thing is.
Okay.
So we've got these Hindu nationalist groups who are very vocal, very actively calling for Aurangzeb's tomb to be demolished.
Right.
And, as you mentioned, it's not like the Taj Mahal.
Oh, no.
It's a pretty, humble grave. It's in a Sufi shrine in Kuldabad. And it's that contrast. That's what strikes me between this, simple reality, right?
Yeah.
And this powerful symbolism that it's taken on in our current political, world.
Absolutely. And that disconnect is really telling. Aurangzeb, from what we can tell, he wanted a simple burial.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a couplet attributed to him. It's almost like this final wish inscribed on his tomb. And it says something like, "The rich may well construct domes of gold and silver on their graves. For the poor folks like me, the sky is enough."
Wow.
Here you have this incredibly powerful emperor, right?
Yeah.
Ruled over this vast empire, and he specifically wanted a modest grave.
It's so interesting.
It clashes so much with this image that's being projected by those who now, want to erase his memory.
Right.
And tragically, as you mentioned, these calls for the demolition have actually led to communal violence. And not even just near the tomb. Like in Nagpur, it's a pretty stark illustration of how much power these historical narratives hold.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it really does feel like the focus is less about who Aurangzeb was historically and more about what he's come to represent for certain political, viewpoints, let's say.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Bollywood, which I think plays a really significant role in how a lot of people understand history, especially in India.
Absolutely. Popular cinema has this undeniable impact on public perception of history. Take, for instance, the film Chhaava.
Okay.
Which is about the Maratha ruler Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj.
Right.
While it's a captivating movie to watch, it really seems to simplify the actual relationship between Sambhaji and Aurangzeb.
Right.
And I think, it could be for dramatic effect to make a clearer narrative, but...
Well, and it's interesting, right? Because those simplifications end up obscuring some really fascinating historical details.
Exactly.
Like, for example, the fact that Sambhaji actually allied with Aurangzeb.
Against his own father.
Yeah, against Shivaji Maharaj.
Yes.
Or that Aurangzeb even gave him a Mughal title.
Uh-huh.
Historians like John F. Richards have said that, for a time, Sambhaji was actually considered Mughal nobility.
Yeah.
And that adds so much, that complicates this simple, Hindu hero versus Muslim villain narrative that's so common in popular portrayals.
Absolutely. And I think these films, maybe unintentionally, but they contribute to this very black and white understanding of history, which then, can really fuel this kind of anger that we're seeing directed at Aurangzeb and his legacy.
Right, yeah.
And this brings us to historians like Audrey Triska, whose concept of the two Aurangzebs, I think, is so insightful for understanding all of this.
Yes, I love her work. Her idea of the two Aurangzebs is really helpful to make sense of this. Essentially, she argues that there's the Aurangzeb of history, right? The actual
Of
ruler.
this massive and diverse empire, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this like Hindutva created Aurangzeb, who's basically like a villain, a caricature
Yeah.
designed for a specific political agenda. It's not really based on an accurate or nuanced understanding of his reign. It's more about cherry picking, I think, events and actions to fit a particular ideology.
And a core part of that caricature is this accusation that he just went around destroying temples out of religious hatred,
Right.
which of course is a narrative that really resonates with certain groups.
Yeah.
But when we actually look deeper into the historical record, like Chushka and other historians have done, it's a much more intricate picture.
It is, yeah. And the evidence really shows that while, yes, he did order the destruction of some temples, the motivations behind it were often political, not just religious.
Yeah.
And sadly, destroying temples was not unique to Aurangzeb. It happened throughout Indian history,
It did, yeah.
and rulers of all religions did it. Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, as well as Muslim. We see it with the Cholas, the Rashtrakutas, the Chalukyas, the Pallas, and many others. These actions were often about consolidating power, punishing rebels, acquiring resources.
Right.
And it's interesting, the focus is always on when Muslim rulers did it.
And not when others did the same thing.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember, the historical analysis point is that Aurangzeb also gave protection to a lot of temples.
Oh, wow.
He even granted land and resources to Hindu institutions.
Interesting.
And this part is, often just conveniently left out
Yeah.
of this simplified narrative. It shows that history is rarely clear-cut.
Right.
And you can't reduce a figure like Aurangzeb to this one-dimensional bad guy.
Yeah.
It ignores a huge part of what actually happened. So for you listening, it's key to realize that this idea of just blaming all temple demolitions on religious bigotry is a massive oversimplification.
Right.
Power dynamics and politics were often the driving force, which is a nuance that's often lost today.
Absolutely. And this selective highlighting, this like omitting of facts, is really at the heart of what's been called the weaponization of history by these right-wing groups.
Right.
And Aurangzeb is just one piece of it.
Right.
I mean, we see similar narratives being used when people make claims over mosques, or they vilify other Mughal rulers, or we see it in debates about Tipu Sultan, for example. This term weaponization of history basically means that you're using historical narratives, often selectively or even inaccurately, to achieve some kind of political goal in the present. So in Aurangzeb's case, it's about constructing this narrative of like this glorious Hindu past
Right.
that was like supposedly, disrupted by Muslim rule, and then using that to justify specific political actions or ideologies today.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the current political climate, especially in recent years, has created an environment where these ideological narratives can sometimes overshadow or even dismiss well-established historical facts
Right.
and, scholarly analysis.
Yeah, and when historical accuracy becomes less important than political, whatever, expediency, that's when we see these controversies and these social divisions.
Yeah.
Historians have always debated Aurangzeb's legacy. And Dr. Trushky's work is really important because it provides a counter-narrative based on solid historical research.
It does. It does.
And the consequences of manipulating history like this, they're huge and really troubling.
Yeah.
This isn't just an academic debate, right?
No, it has real-world consequences.
It does. We've seen how these distorted narratives can lead to violence. They erode trust between communities, and it just undermines the very fabric of a nation. And the irony, and some people have pointed this out, is that those who criticize historians who try to give a more nuanced perspective, they accuse them of having a colonial approach.
Yeah.
But they're the ones using tactics that feel very colonial.
Exactly.
Like using history to divide people, to exacerbate existing social fissures for political gain.
To control the narrative, really.
Yeah, it's this widespread problem, this manipulating history. And Aurangzeb, in this context, he's almost like a symbol of this trend.
Yeah.
And as we've discussed, the dangers are very real. It's not just about getting the history books right. It's because a skewed understanding of the past can have serious negative consequences now and in the future.
Absolutely.
So we've seen that the historical context, the real one, is complex.
Yes.
But, let's think about how these popular narratives, like the ones we see in Bollywood, they contribute to this simplified understanding
Okay.
that fuels this whole controversy. And beyond just that one film, I mean, how common is this Muslim villain trope, this simplification, in all these historical dramas? And what kind of effect does that have on how people understand history?
It's a good question.
Listeners, you might have seen this yourself, this very simplified portrayal of Aurangzeb in movies and media. And it's important to recognize how much influence that can have.
It's true.
So given art of this, what are the bigger lessons we can take from history itself?
Well, I think one of the most important lessons is that we need to engage with the past in an honest way,
Yeah,
in a way that doesn't take sides. We need to recognize that history is complex, it's full of contradictions.
right.
Aurangzeb's reign, for instance, it wasn't all about destroying temples. There were also significant administrative reforms, periods of economic growth in certain sectors, there was cultural exchange happening. But if we only focus on one aspect, we lose sight of the bigger picture, and we miss out on the opportunity to learn from the entirety of that historical experience.
Yeah,
Just think about that for a moment.
yeah.
This emperor, so powerful, his reign was multifaceted, not just a simple story of religious persecution.
It's so true. And the roles of media and education in all this are absolutely crucial, aren't they? We've talked about Bollywood, but it's much bigger than that. The way history is shown in pop culture, the way it's taught in schools, it really shapes how the public understands and believes things.
It really does.
And if those narratives are oversimplified, if they're biased, if they're driven by some agenda, it becomes so much harder for people to develop a critical and nuanced understanding of the past.
Right. We need a much better approach to teaching history, one that emphasizes critical thinking, encourages people to question the dominant narratives, and really present a more balanced and evidence-based account of what happened.
Yeah,
We also need to help people be more media literate so they can critically evaluate the historical information they come across in movies, online, and other types of media.
that's so important.
What's really fascinating to me is this disconnect between the historical accounts, which are very nuanced, and the simplified versions that become popular.
Yeah, and to bring it all together, it really seems like this controversy with Aurangzeb isn't actually about Aurangzeb, the person.
Right.
He's become like a symbol, a focal point in a much larger fight over how India remembers and interprets its own past.
Exactly.
And, what those interpretations are being used for in the current political landscape.
It's not really about getting a clear understanding of 17th century India, is it?
No?
He's become like a tool in today's political battles.
Yeah.
And I think this leads to a big question for you, the listener. How often do we actually examine the historical stories we're told?
That's a great question.
Especially the ones that seem designed to divide us or make us angry. Maybe it's time to move past these selective and often inflammatory interpretations of the past and focus on the complex realities of our shared history.
Yeah.
Learn from its successes and its failures and use that to navigate the challenges we face today.
It's definitely something to think about. History is always there, but how we choose to remember it and who gets to decide that has a huge impact on both the present and the future.
It really does, yeah.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, everyone.